The city did not die with a bang. It didn't even wither. It simply slowed down, like a clockwork toy whose spring had been wound a little too tight for too many years, finally reaching that final, agonizingly slow rotation. My name is Mark. For 12 years, I have worked in the basement of the municipal archive. It is a world of paper, stone, and silence. My days are measured in the dry, rhythmic shuffle of blueprints and the faint, acidic scent of aging vellum. There is a comfort in the archives. Down there, the air is always the same temperature, cool, still, and smelling of dust that settled before I was born. I like the permanence of it. A document placed in box 402 stays in box 402. It doesn't move. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't change its mind. The heat wave began on a Tuesday. It wasn't a sharp, blistering heat, but a heavy, humid blanket that seemed to turn the oxygen into something thick and difficult to swallow. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, stagnant and unmoving. No wind came to clear the exhaust from the street. I first noticed the change on the subway ride home. Usually, the 6:15 p.m. train is a chaotic symphony of exhaustion. You hear the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks, the hiss of the pneumatic doors, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of people who have spent 8 hours selling their lives for a paycheck. In every carriage, you see the sleepers, those commuters who have mastered the art of upright slumber, their heads lolling against the scratched glass, their mouths slightly agape. But that evening, as I sat on the hard, orange plastic seat, I realized the symphony had lost its bass note. The train was packed, yet it was unnervingly quiet. I looked at the man sitting opposite me. He was wearing a cheap gray suit, his briefcase gripped white-knuckled on his lap. His eyes were wide. Not wide with terror, but wide with a strange, glassy focus. He was staring at a flickering fluorescent bulb on the ceiling. I watched him for 3 stops. He didn't blink. Not once. I shifted my gaze to the woman beside him. She was holding a book, her thumb resting on the corner of page 114. She didn't turn the page. She didn't look up. She just stared at the text, her chest rising and falling in shallow, mechanical increments. I felt a faint prickle of unease at the base of my neck. It was that instinctual mammalian response to a predator in the tall grass, the feeling that the rhythm of the herd had been broken. I tried to close my own eyes, to lean back and succumb to my usual 10-minute doze, but the air felt too textured. I could feel every fiber of my shirt against my skin. I could hear the hum of the train's motor, not as a background noise, but as a vibrating chord that resonated in my teeth. When I reached my apartment, the silence of the building felt different. Usually, I hear the muffled sounds of televisions, the clink of silverware, the distant muffled arguments of the couple in 4B. Tonight, there was only the hum of the refrigerator in the hallway. It sounded like a low, continuous growl. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. The tap water felt unusually heavy as it hit the glass. I watched the bubbles rise to the surface and pop. One by one. I stood there for a long time, just watching the water settle until it was a perfect, unmoving mirror. "You're just tired, Mark," I whispered to myself. My voice sounded thin and brittle in the empty kitchen. It didn't provide the comfort I expected. I moved to the living room and sat in my armchair. I didn't turn on the lights. I watched the shadows of the fire escape stretch across the floor as the sun went down. The transition from golden hour to twilight felt agonizingly slow. I could see the individual particles of dust dancing in the last slivers of light. They didn't seem to be falling, they were just suspended, vibrating in place. I thought about the man on the train. I thought about the way his suit jacket was slightly frayed at the cuff. Why did I remember that? I usually don't notice people. But now every detail felt magnified. Every texture, the grain of the wooden floor, the weave of the curtains, seemed to be demanding my attention. I looked at my watch. 10:45 p.m. My body felt like it was made of lead. My joints ached with a dull, throbbing heaviness. My brain felt foggy, wrapped in layers of gray wool. This was the familiar territory of exhaustion. This was the moment where the mind gives up and hands the keys over to sleep. I walked to the bedroom. My movements were sluggish, as if I were wading through waist-deep water. I undressed in the dark, the fabric of my clothes falling to the floor with a soft, heavy thud. I pulled back the sheets. They felt cool and crisp, a temporary sanctuary. I lay down. I rested my head on the pillow. I closed my eyes. I waited for the darkness to pull me under. I waited for that familiar, velvet slide into nothingness, where the thoughts dissolve and the world vanishes. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I could feel the pulse in my pillow. Thump, thump, thump. I could hear the house settling, the microscopic groan of the floorboards as they cooled. I could hear the static of the universe. My eyes were closed, but my mind was wide awake. It wasn't racing with anxiety. It was simply present. I was aware of the position of my toes. I was aware of the weight of the duvet on my ankles. I was aware of the exact distance between my bed and the door. I tried the old tricks. I counted sheep, visualizing them jumping over a wooden fence. But the sheep were too clear. I could see the texture of their wool. I could see the grass beneath their hooves. I could see the splinters in the wood of the fence. My imagination had become too vivid to be a dream. I opened my eyes and looked at the digital clock. 12 a.m. The red numbers glowed in the dark, casting a faint, crimson hue over the room. They didn't flicker. They just sat there, marking a time that felt utterly stagnant. I realized then that I wasn't just awake. I was profoundly, irrevocably conscious, and for the first time, the silence of the city didn't feel like peace. It felt like a bated breath. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a sleep that felt like it had moved to a different continent. I was so tired. My soul felt bruised with fatigue. But the door to the dream world remained locked. And I didn't have the key. The sun did not rise so much as the darkness simply turned thin and translucent. It was a gray, sickly dawn that offered no promise of a new beginning. I had spent 6 hours in the same position, my limbs tracing the exact same indentations in the mattress. My skin felt tight, as if it had shrunk slightly over the bones of my face. I stood up. My movements did not have the stuttering clumsiness of a man who had pulled an all-nighter. Instead, they were fluid, precise, and hauntingly quiet. I felt like an observer inhabiting a machine. I walked to the kitchen and pressed my forehead against the cold, stainless steel of the refrigerator. The vibration of the motor hummed through my skull. It was the only thing that felt real. I decided to go to work. The routine was a tether to the person I used to be. I stepped out into the hallway. The air in the apartment building was stagnant, smelling of old cooking and lemon-scented floor wax. I reached the elevator and pressed the button. I waited. The silence was so absolute that I could hear the faint, metallic stretching of the cables 3 floors above me. When the doors slid open, Mr. Lavrov, my neighbor from 4C, was standing inside. He was a man who usually smelled of peppermint and expensive tobacco. Now, he just smelled of nothing. He was dressed in his usual tweed jacket, but his tie was slightly crooked. He didn't look at me when I stepped in. He was staring at the small, brass capacity plate on the elevator wall. "Good morning, Mikhail," I said. My voice sounded heavy, as if the words were made of wet clay. He didn't turn his head. He didn't even blink. He just watched the brass plate as if he were reading a holy text. "Mark," he whispered. His voice was a dry rattle. "Do you hear that?" I listened. The elevator descended with a smooth, oiled hiss. "I hear the cables," I said. "No," Mikhail said, finally turning his eyes toward me. His pupils were so dilated that his eyes looked like 2 holes burnt into a sheet of paper. The humming, behind the walls. It's the sound of the city, thinking. I didn't answer. There was no logic to apply to his words, yet I knew exactly what he meant. There was a vibration in the air, a low-frequency tension that felt like a bowstring being drawn back, inch by agonizing inch, but never being released. I walked to the subway station. The streets were filled with people, but there was no rush in the rush hour. No one was running for the bus. No one was dodging through the crowd. We moved like a funeral procession for a person who hadn't died yet. As I walked, I noticed a man standing by a newsstand. He was holding a newspaper, but his eyes were fixed on a puddle of oil on the asphalt. He wasn't reading. He was just witnessing. A pigeon landed a few inches from his foot. Usually, the bird would flutter away at the slightest movement. But the man didn't move and the bird didn't fly. They both just stood there, caught in the same invisible amber. I reached the archives by 8:30 a.m. My boss, a man named Henderson who lived for spreadsheets and punctuality, wasn't in his office. His door was open. His coat was hanging on the rack. His coffee mug was sitting on his desk, a thin, white film of cold cream forming on the surface of the liquid. I went down to the basement. The smell of the archives, the dust and the paper, usually felt like a sanctuary. Today, it felt like a tomb. I pulled out box 712, Subterranean Electrical Schematics, 1954 to 1958. I opened the first folder. I began to read. My mind felt like a high-definition camera. I wasn't just skimming the text. I was absorbing the texture of the ink, the weight of the paper, the exact angle of the staples. My brain was working with terrifying efficiency, but there was no joy in it. It was mechanical. Around 11 a.m., I heard a sound from the back of the stacks. Freight. Pause. Freight. It was the sound of a metal chair being moved across a concrete floor. Slowly, I stood up and walked toward the sound. The basement was lit by long rows of flickering fluorescent tubes. They hummed, a high-pitched, electric whine that seemed to drill directly into my frontal lobe. I turned the corner. Andre, my colleague, was sitting at a small sorting table. He wasn't sorting. He was holding a single sheet of paper in both hands. He was staring at it so intensely that his hands were trembling. "Andre," I called out. He didn't flinch. He didn't look up. "It's the same, Mark," he said. His voice was eerily calm, devoid of any inflection. "I've been reading this sentence for 3 hours. Every time I get to the end, I realize I haven't understood a single word. So I start again, and again, and again. Put the paper down, Andre. Let's go upstairs and get some air." He finally looked at me. His face was a mask of gray exhaustion, yet his eyes were bright, feverish, and hauntingly alert. "The air is the same up there, Mark. Haven't you felt it? The oxygen is getting old. It's being breathed over and over again. We're all just recycling the same breath." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I tried to close my eyes in the break room. I pressed my palms against my eyelids until I saw stars. But even behind my eyelids, I could see the room. I could see the table. I could see the clock. "The world won't let me out, Mark. The door is stuck." I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. It wasn't the shiver of fear, but the shiver of recognition. He was describing the same wall I had hit at 3 a.m. The realization that our consciousness was no longer a flicker, it was a steady, unyielding flame that refused to be extinguished. "We just need to wait," I said, though I didn't know what we were waiting for. "The body has limits. Eventually, we'll just collapse." Andre looked back at the paper. "That's the problem, Mark. Look at my pulse." He held out his wrist. I placed my fingers on his cool skin. His heart was beating. But it wasn't the frantic thumping of a stressed man. It was slow, deep, constant, 60 beats per minute. Perfect, rhythmic, indestructible. His body wasn't failing. It was settling into a permanent state of wakefulness. The limit we were all waiting for, the point where the brain shuts down to protect itself, simply wasn't coming. I left him there, staring at his sentence. I walked back to my desk, but I didn't sit down. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by millions of pages of history. I realized that the silence of the archives was no longer a comfort. It was a mirror. I looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand moved with agonizing precision. Tick, tick, tick. I realized I hadn't blinked in a very long time. My eyes felt dry, like marbles rolled in sand, but I didn't feel the urge to close them. I just stood there, watching the second hand, wondering how many more times it would have to go around before something, anything, finally broke. By the fourth day, the concept of day had lost its meaning. There was only the light period and the dark period. The light period was a pale, washed-out gray that felt like looking through a dirty window. The dark period was a heavy, indigo void where the streetlights hummed like angry hornets. I stopped going to the archives. It wasn't a conscious decision. I simply found myself standing at my front door, keys in hand, and realized that there was no point. The documents were still there. Box 712 was still on the table. Andre was likely still staring at the same sentence. Time was moving, but history had stopped. I decided to walk. Not to get anywhere, but because the friction of my shoes against the pavement was the only way I could feel the passage of space. The city had entered a state of ritual. I walked past a laundromat. Inside, the machines were tumbling, their rhythmic thump-slosh echoing into the street. A woman was sitting on a plastic chair, her hands folded neatly over a wicker basket. I watched her through the glass. Her laundry had finished spinning 20 minutes ago. The machine was silent, but she didn't move. She wasn't asleep. She was looking at a stray blue sock stuck to the glass door of the dryer. I stood there for what felt like an hour, watching her watch the sock. Neither of us moved. The air between us felt thick, like a transparent gel. I began to count her breaths. 1 every 10 seconds. Deep, measured, eternal. I moved on. In the park, I saw a man feed a pigeon. He held a piece of bread crust between his thumb and forefinger. He didn't toss it. He just held it out. The pigeon stood on the path, its head cocked to the side, one orange eye fixed on the bread. They were both frozen in a stalemate of patience. I walked between them, and neither of them acknowledged my presence. I felt like a ghost walking through a world of statues. It was the repetition that began to weigh on me. The way the shadows of the trees hit the same cracks in the sidewalk. The way the wind, when it blew at all, always carried the faint, metallic scent of ozone and wet concrete. I went into a grocery store. The fluorescent lights flickered in a specific, mathematical rhythm. Long, short, short, long. I stood in the aisle of canned goods for a long time. The labels were all perfectly aligned. Hundreds of identical red soup cans. I realized I was looking for a flaw. I wanted one label to be crooked. I wanted one can to be dented. I needed a sign that entropy still existed. But there was none. Everything was in its place. I found a clerk at the back of the store. He was holding a price tag gun. He was staring at a box of cereal. "Excuse me," I said. My voice felt like it was being muffled by a thick curtain. He didn't turn. "It's 4.99, he said. His voice was a flat, synthesized drone. "It was 4.99 yesterday. It will be 4.99 tomorrow. Are you tired?" I asked. He slowly turned his head. His skin looked like wax that had been polished. There were no wrinkles, no signs of stress, only a terrifying, smooth clarity. "I am beyond tired," he whispered. "Tired is a place I left behind miles ago. I am finished. But I am still here. Does anyone sleep?" He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. His eyes remained fixed and cold. "We don't need to sleep anymore. Haven't you noticed? The hunger is gone. The thirst is gone. The exhaustion has become a part of our bones. It's like a new limb. You don't notice your arm until it hurts. Now we don't notice our fatigue. It's just who we are." I left the store without buying anything. I returned to my apartment building. As I climbed the stairs, I heard the sound from 4C. Thep, pause, thep, pause. Mikhail Lavrov was walking. It was the same pace I had heard the night before. And the night before that. I stood outside his door, my ear pressed to the cool wood. Thep, Pause. Step. Pause. I began to hum along with his footsteps. It was a low, mournful tone. I realized that if I stood there long enough, I would become part of the rhythm. I would become the sound in the hallway. I retreated into my own apartment. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. My eyes had adjusted to the permanent twilight. I could see the grain in the wallpaper. I could see the microscopic scratches on the doorknob. I sat on the edge of my bed. I looked at my hands. I began to open and close them. Open, close, open, close. I did this for hours. I wanted to see if I would get tired. I wanted to feel the lactic acid burn in my muscles. I wanted my hands to fail me. But they didn't. They moved with the same effortless precision on the 1,000th time as they did on the first. My body was no longer consuming itself. It was simply existing. Like a stone. Like a piece of furniture. The horror wasn't in the change. The horror was in the lack of it. I looked at the clock. 3:14 a.m. The same time I had woken up or stayed awake. The night before. The same red glow. The same silence. I began to realize that the first crack I had felt earlier wasn't a break in the world. It was a break in me. The world was fine. The world was perfect. It was my expectation of an end to the day, an end to the work, an end to the life, that was being denied. I lay back on the bed. I didn't close my eyes this time. What was the point? The ceiling was there. The crack in the plaster was there. It hadn't grown. It hadn't moved. It was a permanent map of a journey that went nowhere. I realized then that the city wasn't thinking, as Mikhail had said. The city was waiting. We were all waiting. For a sound that would never come. For a light that would never fade. For a sleep that had been erased from the menu of human possibilities. The sixth day, if I can still call it that, brought a new kind of coldness. It wasn't the temperature of the air. The thermometer on my balcony stayed fixed at a stagnant 22 degrees. It was a coldness of the soul. A realization that the why of the situation was a door that had been slammed and locked from the other side. I sat in my armchair, the one with the frayed velvet arms that used to feel like a reward after a long day at the office. Now it felt like a cage. I spent hours, or perhaps it was minutes, tracing the pattern of the fabric with my index finger. Over and over. Each loop of the thread was a tiny mountain range. Each stain was a continent. I began to talk to myself, not out loud at first. The thoughts were just a low, constant murmur behind my eyes. Is it just here? I wondered. Is it just this city? This street? This room? I thought about the archives. I thought about the thousands of records I had filed away. If I were there now, I could find the blueprints for the city's water mains. I could find the electrical grid. I could find the names of the people who lived in this building 100 years ago. Everything was documented. Everything had a beginning, a middle, and an end. But this had no record. There was no blueprint for a world that refused to dim. I stood up and walked to the window. I stayed there for a long time, my forehead pressed against the glass. The pain was cool, but it warmed slowly under my skin until we were the same temperature. I couldn't tell where I ended and the window began. Across the street, in the apartment directly opposite mine, a man was standing at his window. He was wearing a white undershirt. He was holding a glass of water. He had been holding that glass for 3 hours. He didn't drink. He just looked out at the gray sky. His reflection mirrored in the glass just as mine was. What did we do? I whispered. My voice was a ghost, a thin rasp that barely disturbed the dust in the room. I began to construct hypotheses. My mind, stripped of the fog of sleep, had become a cruel, relentless machine. It demanded answers. Hypothesis 1. This is a collective hallucination. A mass psychogenic illness. Something in the water, or the air, or the frequency of the cellular towers. We are all dreaming that we are awake. I rejected it. The detail was too high. The grain of the wood, the smell of the stagnant coffee, the ache in my lower back. Dreams don't have this kind of texture. Dreams are fluid. This was made of iron. Hypothesis 2. Time has stopped. I rejected that too. The clock on the wall was still ticking. The second hand moved. The minutes became hours. If time had stopped, the clock would be frozen. No, time was moving perfectly. It was we who had been uncoupled from its flow. We were like passengers on a train that had reached the end of the line, but the doors wouldn't open, and the engine wouldn't stop. Hypothesis 3. The error. This was the thought that stuck. The one that began to itch at the back of my brain like a splinter. What if the universe is just a sequence of repetitions? A cycle of birth, growth, sleep, and death. And what if, in our frantic, modern hurry, we simply skipped a beat? We broke the rhythm. We moved too fast, we stayed up too late, we filled the night with artificial suns and the silence with digital noise until the mechanism just gave up. Like a record player where the needle has jumped the groove. We are now playing the same silent fraction of a second, over and over, while the turntable continues to spin. I started to pace. My apartment felt smaller. The walls seemed to have moved inward by an inch. I looked at my books on the shelf. I had read them all. I knew the endings. I knew the fates of the characters. I felt a sudden, violent surge of jealousy toward them. They had endings. They reached the final period on the final page, and then they were allowed to rest in the dark. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. It didn't refresh me. It just made me wet and cold. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were the problem. They were too clear. The whites were a brilliant, terrifying porcelain. There was no redness, no puffiness. My body was refusing to show the damage of its exhaustion. It was pretending to be fine. It was lying to me. Close them, I commanded my reflection. Just close them. I squeezed my eyes shut. I used my muscles to hold them down. I counted. 1, 2, 3. But behind my lids, the internal light was even brighter. I saw the map of my own veins. I saw the phantom pulse of the room I had just been looking at. I could still hear the humming. The humming was louder in the dark. It was a vibration that seemed to say, "Not yet. Not ever." I opened my eyes. The mirror was still there. I was still there. I felt a sudden, desperate need for a mistake. I wanted to spill something. I wanted to break a plate. I wanted to feel the sharp, irreparable sting of a choice that couldn't be undone. Because in a world of perfect, infinite wakefulness, a mistake is the only thing that proves you are still alive. I walked back into the living room. My eyes fell on the telephone. It sat on the side table, a black plastic relic of a world where people called each other to say they were tired, or that they were going to bed. I picked up the receiver. I didn't dial a number. I just listened to the dial tone. It was a flat, unyielding F-sharp. A constant, electronic hum that matched the humming in the walls and the humming in my blood. It was the sound of a system that was waiting for an input that would never come. I stayed there, the receiver pressed to my ear, for a time I cannot measure. I wasn't waiting for a voice. I was just listening to the sound of the line. I realized then that the conflict wasn't between me and the world. It was between me and the silence. And the silence was winning. It was absorbing my thoughts, my memories, my very will to move. I had to do something. I had to make a move. Not a big move. Just a small, quiet choice. A choice to step off the track. I looked at my coat hanging by the door. I looked at the keys. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in the repetition. I needed to find the place where the needle had jumped the groove. I needed to find the end of the sentence. I left my apartment at what must have been 4 in the morning. I didn't lock the door. The concept of property and security felt like remnants of a civilization that had already passed away. If someone wanted to walk into my home and sit in my chair and stare at my walls, they were welcome to it. We were all sharing the same vast, waking nightmare now. The stairwell was a vertical tunnel of shadows. I descended slowly, my hand sliding along the mahogany banister. The wood felt unervingly smooth, as if it had been polished by 1,000 nervous palms. On the second-floor landing, I saw a cat. It was a tabby, sitting perfectly upright on a doormat. It didn't meow. It didn't stretch. Its eyes were wide, glowing with an unblinking, emerald intensity. It watched me pass, its head turning with mechanical precision. We were both part of the same stillness. I stepped out onto the street. The air was different here, not fresher, but thinner. It felt like the atmosphere of the moon. I began to walk toward the industrial district. I wanted to see the rusted things, the broken things, the places where the city's perfection hadn't yet reached. As I walked, the scale of the stasis became overwhelming. I passed a 24-hour diner. Behind the large plate glass window, a waitress stood with a coffee pot in her hand. A customer sat at the counter. The coffee was not pouring. The man was not eating. They were simply looking at each other across the Formica divide. There was no anger on their faces. No frustration. Just a profound, hollow patience. They looked like they had been there for a century. I kept walking until the paved streets gave way to cracked asphalt and gravel. This was the edge of the city, where the warehouses stood like giant, eyeless beasts in the gray light. Then I saw it. It was a small shop, nestled between two towering concrete walls. It was an old-fashioned apothecary, the kind that shouldn't exist in a modern city. The windows were small and cluttered with dark glass bottles and dried herbs that had turned to gray dust. A sign above the door, swinging on a rusted hinge that made no sound, simply said, "Remedies." A faint, amber light flickered inside. It was the first light I had seen that didn't feel electric. It looked like a candle. It looked like something that could be blown out. I pushed the door open. A bell chimed, a low, melodic silver sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest for a long time after it ended. The air inside the shop was cool and smelled of damp earth and crushed cloves. It was a thick, ancient smell that felt like it belonged to the time before the Great Insomnia. Behind the counter stood a woman. She was so old that her face seemed to be made of shadows and soft linen. She was wearing a white coat that was yellowed with age, its buttons mismatched. She was looking at a small, brass scale. She didn't look up when I approached. "I can't sleep," I said. My voice was a whisper, but in the silence of the shop, it sounded like a shout. "No one can," she replied. She didn't look at me. She placed a tiny, lead weight on the scale. "The rhythm is broken. The world has forgotten how to close its eyes." "I want it to stop," I said. "The waiting. The thinking. I want to reach the end of the day." She finally raised her eyes. They were not glassy like the others. They were deep, dark, and filled with a terrifyingly clear intelligence. She looked at me not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. A calculation to be finished. "There is no end anymore," she said, her voice like the rustle of a dry map. "There is only the middle. We are all stuck in the middle of a breath. You are asking to exhale." "Yes," I said. "I am asking to exhale." She reached beneath the counter. Her movements were not slow like the people on the street. They were deliberate, purposeful. She pulled out a small, glass vial. Inside were 2 white tablets. They were so white they seemed to pull the light out of the air. "This is not a cure," she whispered, placing the vial on the glass counter between us. "A cure implies that the world will return to the way it was. The world will not return. This is simply a departure." "A departure to where?" "To the silence," she said. "The real silence. The one that doesn't hum." I looked at the tablets. They were small, mundane. They looked like something you would take for a headache or a mild fever. It was a quiet choice. There was no drama in it. No lightning. No grand sacrifice. Just a man in a dusty shop, holding a small glass bottle. I reached for my wallet. "Don't," she said, her hand stopping mine. Her skin was as cold as a stone in a winter stream. "You cannot pay for time that has already been spent. Take them. They were waiting for you." I picked up the vial. The glass was heavy. "What happens if I take them?" I asked. She leaned back into the shadows behind the counter until I could only see the glint of her dark eyes. "The error will be corrected," she said. "For you." I turned and walked toward the door. As my hand touched the brass handle, I looked back. The shop was empty. The candle was gone. The woman was gone. There was only the smell of dust and the faint, dying chime of the bell. I stepped back out into the gray world. I felt the weight of the vial in my pocket. It felt like an anchor. It felt like the only solid thing in a city made of ghosts. I didn't go back to the archives. I didn't go to see Andre. I walked back toward my apartment, but I didn't rush. I watched the people. I watched the woman in the diner. I watched the man at the newsstand. I felt a strange, detached pity for them. They were still waiting for a train that had already left the station. I had my ticket in my pocket. I reached my building. I climbed the stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4. I reached my door. I walked inside. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. The dust was still suspended in the air. The red glow of the clock was still marking the stagnant seconds. I went to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I sat at my small wooden table. I placed the 2 white tablets on the surface. They looked like 2 tiny, unblinking eyes. I wasn't afraid. I didn't feel despair. I felt the relief of a man who has finally found the exit in a darkened theater. I took the first tablet. I took the second. I swallowed them with a single sip of water. And then I sat back. And I waited. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for tomorrow. I was just waiting for the end of today. This is part 6. Consequences and the quiet final. The conclusion of the story. The pace slows to a crawl, focusing on the sensory transition from existence to absence. There are no answers, only the finality of the choice. The transition did not feel like a drug taking hold. It did not feel like a wave or a sudden descent. It felt like the world was simply being erased, one layer at a time. I sat in my chair and watched the kitchen clock. The red digits began to lose their sharp edges. The glow didn't fade, it just became less relevant. I realized I was no longer counting the seconds. I was no longer aware of the rhythm. The tick and the tack had merged into a single, continuous line of sound that eventually thinned out into nothing. I looked down at my hands on the table. They looked like marble. They didn't feel like they belonged to me anymore. I tried to move my index finger, just a fraction of an inch, but the command from my brain seemed to get lost in the vast distance between my mind and my skin. I didn't mind. The effort to move felt like an old, unnecessary habit. The humming in the walls, the sound of the city thinking, began to change pitch. It grew deeper, vibrating in my chest, and then it began to recede. It sounded like a train pulling away from a platform, the roar of the engine becoming a drone, then a whisper, then a memory. The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating silence of the last week. It was a hollow silence, a clean silence. I stood up, or at least I thought I did. It felt as though I was floating a few inches above the floor. I walked, or drifted, into the bedroom. I looked out the window one last time. The city was still there. The man in the white undershirt was still standing at his window across the street. But he looked different now. He looked like a photograph of a man. A static image captured in a moment that had no before and no after. The buildings, the streetlights, the stagnant gray sky, it all looked like a painted backdrop for a play that had finished its run and been forgotten by the audience. I lay down on my bed. The sheets did not feel cool or crisp. They felt like nothing. I realized I was losing my sense of touch. Then my sense of smell. The scent of dust and cloves from the apothecary vanished, replaced by an absolute neutrality. I closed my eyes. This time, there was no internal light. There were no phantoms of the room dancing behind my lids. There was no map of my veins. There was only a vast, cool darkness. It was the darkness I had been searching for since the heat wave began. I felt a final, lingering thought flicker in my mind. A question. Was the error in the world, or was the error in me? I thought of Andre, still staring at his sentence in the basement. I thought of the woman at the laundromat, watching her blue sock. I realized that they were still there, locked in their perfect, eternal wakefulness. They were the ones who stayed behind in the machine. They were the ones who would never exhale. I felt a strange sense of lightness. The weight of my memories, my name, my years in the archive, it was all being unspooled. I wasn't falling. I was dissolving. I thought of the old woman's words. The error will be corrected. For you. The correction was complete. The world of the Great Insomnia was still out there, humming and waiting and watching with glassy eyes. But it was no longer my world. I had found the hole in the fence. I had stepped through the crack in the glass. I waited for a dream to start. I waited for a vision, a memory, a flicker of something to take me into the night. But there were no dreams. There was only the void. A peaceful, empty, and absolute silence. The last thing I felt was the sensation of my own breath. A long, slow inhale. And then, finally, the exhale. The city remained. The lights remained. The people remained. Everything was exactly as it had been. But the room was empty.